Welcome to Power Struggle. I'm your host, Stewart Muir. Today's guest is Terry Etam, described by industry peers as the most influential voice in the Canadian oil patch and an industry thought leader whose writing has educated, challenged, and inspired thousands of readers to rethink energy policy, economics, and reality in an era of intense ideological polarization on energy issues. It's great to have you in the studio today, Terry.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
You bring a rare combination of practical experience, sharp analysis to the energy conversation. I've been following you for years, but over more than 25 years of hands-on experience spanning production, trading, storage, transportation. You've really started with a hands-on-the-tools approach, and now you're a communicator. That's really rare. And at the same time, you've held executive roles across finance, commodity, trading, logistics, production in Canada's dynamic hydrocarbon sector based out of Calgary, where you're based.
Right.
Now, rather than retreat into corporate silence, you, Terry, chose, after you acquired all of those experiences in the energy industry, to step into the public arena as a writer. First on the platform of your own making, the Public Energy #1, love that name, and later as a prominent columnist for the widely read BOE report, and you're still a columnist there.
I am, yes.
Now your columns have become must-reads for the industry. For those listening to Power Struggle today haven't heard of it, it is really kind of the daily Bible, one of those publications.
It's a great website. It covers the whole spectrum of energy happenings in an objective manner. I think it's just the news.
It's where you get your information if you're in that world, policymakers, professionals. You're also the author of a best-selling book, The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, Clearing the Air Before Cleaning the Air. And we're going to get into some of those threads. But this became a touchstone, this book, for people looking for reasoned arguments in energy debates, especially over the last decade, when in Canada, that was quite a pitched debate a lot of the time. But I want to set the stage for this conversation. I think it's important because what sets you apart is your refusal to pander to extremes and your advocacy for what you've often called energy literacy. I mean, that's the term. A grounded understanding that energy is life and that the path forward lies in pragmatic innovation rather than ideological purism. That comes through in your writings, every column in one way or another. So Terry, you've been in the Canadian energy sector for a quarter of a century or more. What drew you in?
It's a bit more now, actually. My book came out 5 years ago now, 6 years ago. What drew me in was where I came from. I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, and the options were limited when I was exiting high school. The imperative was to get a job. And so I headed down the path of, there's nothing locally. There was nothing in Saskatoon even, or in the province much. And the oil patch was quite healthy at the time. There was a lot of recruiting that was happening on campus. And so I was fortunate enough to land a summer job in Alberta. And so I came out here and worked in a field office, and I absolutely loved it. Just the action and the pace of development and the professionalism of it all. And it just drew me right to it. And then I was fortunate enough to get a second summer job. And then after graduation, there were job offers in Calgary that didn't exist anywhere else. And so I just gravitated into the field, and I just never left. It just felt very entrepreneurial and welcoming to newcomers.
You say you're a farm boy. Now, I know you put yourself through school. How did that start? How did you get yourself through school?
When I knew that I was leaving the farm to go to university, I had to come up with a way to do it because it was not, we weren't a wealthy family. And so I had to self-finance my way through. And that was part of the farm life of growing up. My father, when we were younger, we didn't get an allowance. We didn't have money for allowances. He gave my brothers and I each a little pig. And when it was 10 or 12 or something like that, and we could do with it what we wanted. When it grew up, we could sell it and spend the money, or we could reinvest it into more livestock. And so that's what my brothers and I did. And we kind of grew that into something where we could sell something every year, like our own crop. And then we could blow the money, or we could reinvest it. And so I kept up with that until I had enough of a pool to go to university. And
what was your herd when you went off to university?
The launching, my herd that launched me through university was 12 breeding cows, so I sold the calves every year and then helped my dad out in the summer to the extent I could when I was off time and not working on my summer job in the oil patch, but I would stay home to help with harvest and whatnot. And so dovetailed it with farm life as much as I could and got me through university.
So you got yourself established in the energy business, but then you moved into writing. What was the trigger for you to want to say more and in a public way?
At a certain point in my career, I think I realized that there wasn't enough being said on the educational front to the general wider audience, and so I felt the need to start writing about it. The industry tends to be, I view it as engineering-led, so there's a lot of logical thinking that people will understand energy because it just makes sense. Energy is the basis of everything. We use fuel every day. We use heating fuel every day. We use it to move around, and people will understand the importance of it. And I don't think that happened with the public over time. I could see it with the energy wars that developed, with the attacks on the existing production sector. It seemed like, no, someone's missing the point here, and so someone has to step in and say, like, people, we need to realize where everything comes from. And that's part of my farm upbringing as well, is like people don't think about where things come from. They think that food comes from a supermarket, but it comes from a farm that people grew and slaughtered animals and harvested grain, and our buildings don't heat themselves automatically, and we don't get gasoline automatically. It comes from somewhere, and so people have to start telling the story about how it gets there, and that there's people involved, and it's a critical industry. So it seemed like there was a void that was developing. There was opponents of the hydrocarbon sector, which were telling their story with free rein. I would say defenders. When I became a defender, even though I didn't mean to, it was just more like, whoa, like that's not the whole picture. Here's part of the picture too, which people need to realize how critical the fuels that we have are, and how difficult it would be to change systems. Like that was a really key driver, I think, was that people were selling easy answers. We'll just switch to wind or solar or whatever. And the reality is just so light years away from that. But there were a few people that were standing up and pointing that out in any kind of logical manner, without just getting defensive, which is a challenge too for the oil patch, is just to be defensive because they were under attack. So I think that's human nature. So I sort of stepped into that void, it felt like. And there were others too, but not that many at the time, that were trying to bridge that gap. So.
Mm-hmm. It seems like energy literacy is one of those things I often hear from executives in business, from professionals, engineering, geologists. If only the public knew the facts. Do you feel that filling the fact vacuum or countering facts that don't bring understanding is something that can bring about change, or is it futile?
It's an interesting discussion to focus on the facts of energy, because that's a double-edged sword in a sense. One, the discussion should be factual. It has to be. But at the same time, facts go over a lot of people's heads. If I say that an average gas well produces 500 gigajoules a day, that's true, but that means nothing to someone. If I say if an average gas well heats 150 homes, that's quite a different thing. So imperative to use facts is there, but you have to make them present them in a way that's relatable to people so that they can absorb them, because they don't otherwise. Like to say 1 million barrels a day of production, like what does that mean? Like a barrel is a very odd unit of measure, and you can't picture that. The average person can't picture that. Is that a lot, or is it, well, global production is over 100 million barrels a day, so okay, so 1 million is quite a bit, but in the Canadian context is a lot. So just factual basis is important, but we have to bridge the gap to the reality that people understand, which is what my book was aimed at. It was aimed at my audience's audience, the people that are curious about energy, that say, what's the real story here? But I don't want to hear about the nitty gritty or just a bunch of hard numbers that don't mean anything.
Right. So it was aimed at your audience's audience. What do you mean exactly?
I felt that my audience was largely energy professionals that were frustrated that their message wasn't getting out. That seemed to be who it most resonated with. So my writing, particularly for the BOE report, but originally for my own website, was to explain the industry better to a world that didn't seem to understand it at all and tends not to care. We don't care about utilities. We don't care about sewage systems. We don't care about heating ducts. That's just, we only have space in our minds for so many things. We worry about groceries and bills and things like that. And we take everything else for granted. So my audience cares about energy, and they care that people don't know about energy. So there were so many people within my circle that were frustrated that they couldn't get points across to people. And so I thought, well, maybe I can help. Maybe I'll write a book that's, in my view, it's a simplistic view of, or it simplifies problems that are complex into relatable situations. There's chapters on what does an oil spill mean? Like, what is it? Like, what are the actual consequences? Is it as devastating as people say? Well, it certainly can be. But what's the whole story about an oil spill? An oil spill has an impact, for example, of creating new global standards for shipping or for safety or whatever. So we build on incidents. They're unfortunate. No one wants them, of course. But and I'm not saying we should have more of them, but it's a fact that when something bad happens, the whole world can change for the better for it. Like airline safety or anything like that as well. So
right. You mentioned pipelines specifically, and I think a good bit of context here for the audience today is that you spent a lot of years in the pipeline industry, so you acquired a lot of knowledge. And we are looking as a country, as Canada, at possibly a new Alberta pipeline to Tidewater. That's the subject of the MOU between Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta and Prime Minister Mark Carney. Let's talk about the prospect of a new pipeline, starting from what you've just said, that this process of understanding the scale, the relative issues. What do you think, as we freshly embark on potentially a new national conversation, we need to do to have a better outcome than before? Because things got more expensive. Major projects that were worthy were canceled. There was a huge flight from Canada as a place to invest. The reputational damage from that has not been restored as yet. The question of whether the world needs Canadian oil seems to have been answered. It does. Look at how much it's buying, everything that the new Trans Mountain line can get to the world wants. So what's different in 2026, Terry, that might allow for a better future here?
From a pipeline perspective, if we want to discuss what's different in 2026, it's there's been a shift in the past couple of years about a refocusing on energy security, and that's, I think, changed the discussion dramatically. And the pipeline story itself is very deep and complex. It's not as simple as a current struggle about whether a pipeline should be built in a certain location or not. If you take a step back in Canada's history of pipelines, Dave Yeager wrote a fantastic book about the history of the Canadian energy sector. Another
Alberta energy expert.
That's right, another internal person. He works in the oil field services sector and has for a very long time. So his book chronicled the history of pipeline development and the development of the oil scene in Alberta. There's little known facts that, for example, that the two main pipelines that carry oil out of Alberta were mandated by not just the Alberta government, but the federal government. The federal government wanted pipelines built because then Alberta didn't necessarily want pipelines built because then it was a finite resource. It wasn't known how expansive oil fields were. Was it fairly localized? There was enough for Alberta and Western Canada's needs. If we drain it all to Eastern Canada or elsewhere, like what does that leave the province? So it's a totally different mindset when federal governments wanted that infrastructure built. And that dominated global geopolitics at the time as well. The United States was desperate, is maybe not the best word, but not far from it. They needed to secure oil supplies to provide their growing economy, the biggest in the world. And they went everywhere in the world to make sure that they could secure oil supplies. Canada was no different in a microcosm. So we built pipelines by federal mandate. And then over time, once everything was sort of sorted out, I guess, there were enough pipelines to meet Eastern Canadian needs and Central Canadian needs and the US and relative stability with the infrastructure that had built out. then it became a bit of a complacent scene, I think, until the narrative shifted when the pipelines became a challenge to build because people didn't want them built. So that kind of just crept in over time, I think, as things tend to do, that a pipeline became a controversial thing, even though there was like hundreds of thousands of miles of pipe running underneath our feet. We don't even know they're there. They've been there for so long. And they operate safely and efficiently. It is the best way to move around product that there is. It's the safest, and as long as they're maintained properly, it's not a problem. So in 2026, I think now it's there was a lull probably 5 years ago where there was the feeling that we had to get away from hydrocarbons, that humanity depended on it, and I think that's sort of taken a back seat now to the fact that we need energy security more than anything. So,
So for those who believe the humanity's growing, incessant demand for more energy is going to require all of the above options. It's going to require hydrocarbons to be responsibly developed and used. It's going to require renewables. It's going to require other forms. If nuclear is kind of in its own class, we're going to need that. In a world where you seem to have to, pick your corner, renewables, you're in this corner arguing for renewables and against everything else. Oil and gas in that corner, same thing. But that's not reality. What is energy reality for someone who's trying to put it all together and operate in a world that does demand more energy?
The energy reality is that all of the above is required, and that's going to grow in a bunch of different directions, and we don't even know what they are yet. But I think that if we look back at the history of energy, it began with wood, and then it switched to coal, and then it switched to oil, and now it's branched out into more natural gas and renewables and nuclear as well. And it's all additive. The energy pie just keeps getting big, demand just getting bigger. It's not like a finite pie that gets divided differently, which is what a lot of people seem to think. But demand just keeps growing. There's the golden billion, they're called, the Western civilization that lives very well, mainly based on cheap energy. And the other 7 billion people want to live like the 8 billion. So if we think of what that could do to energy consumption, if India and China and Pakistan and Indonesia and populous countries like that start consuming, everything, but energy in the same per capita amounts that Westerners do, like oil demand or energy demand would go through the roof. And that's where, and all of the above story starts to make sense. There's one, I butt heads with people in the oil patch sometimes when I say that it's, in my view, at some point we will be moving away from hydrocarbons as the cheapest reserves are developed and used up. There's a lot of hydrocarbons out there, and we're a long ways from that, but it will just get more and more difficult to access them. They're deeper under the ocean or further offshore or in Arctic locations. The easy stuff will get used up, and we will gradually morph to other things. I think we'll be using hydrocarbons for a very long time, but over time we will shift to more nuclear, and renewables will be integrated into the mix, and there'll be new technologies that'll come along as well. So,
because these are economic choices.
They're economic choices. The cost to find a barrel was dominated by the Middle East, for example. So Saudi Arabia could produce vast quantities of oil for very little capital, and then they just adjusted the flow through OPEC to keep prices kind of where they want them. They've been doing that for 40, 50 years now or something. But their reserves they have a lot of reserves, but they're not finding or adding them like they used to. And the new reserve additions globally aren't happening like they used to either. So now we're turning into more of a harvester of the known reserves. There will be new discoveries, of course, but it's a globe, and it's been drilled up.
What makes Canadian oil, especially Alberta oil, because we have offshore in the Atlantic as well, and some other producing areas like Saskatchewan, a little bit from BC, but primarily when we talk about Canadian oil, it's Alberta. What makes it distinct? What makes it worthwhile making sure that we have that in the mix?
What makes Canadian oil distinctive and worthwhile, I think, is, for one, it's just a dominant economic driver of prosperity. And it's a secure energy supply, which that's something that we take for granted, is that much of the world does not have that. They rely on energy, energy is life. You need it for cooking, for heating. And if you don't have it, that means you're dependent on someone else to get it, which isn't the best feeling. And we're so blessed in Canada to have everything. But on the energy side, we have these vast reserves of oil, which there's different kinds of oil. There's the oil sands, which is the biggest deposit. There's the conventional oil sector, which is off the East Coast as well, in various parts of Canada, into Saskatchewan. And so there's different products that come out of it, and a lot of natural gas as well. So it's quite a balance. We have heavy oil, which is useful for some refineries and in various parts of the world where they built refineries to take it, including the US. There's lighter oil, which is more versatile and more easy to move around because it's not so thick and viscous, and it doesn't require...
Now, Terry, you talk about the oil sands, that's heavy oil. Mm-hmm. And Canada is not the only place in the world that produces heavy oil. Iraq and Venezuela and Russia, maybe a couple of other places, but Canada has a lot of that, and the world needs it. Often there is a critique that Canada needs to become more of a technology-driven nation. It needs to embrace manufacturing because that's argued to be the future. But when you look at our actual trade statistics, crude oil is our biggest, most valuable trade commodity right now, although at the moment, perhaps gold is. By value, I don't know with the crazy prices, but in terms of year in, year out, crude really is it. What do you say to those who look at oil as the mainstay of our Canadian economy and say, this is wrong, we need to move to these other areas because that's the future?
Well, I think oil and hydrocarbons will remain a mainstay of our economy for some time. First of all, because the world demands it in ever-increasing quantities, and there aren't that many places that have it, and there are even fewer places that have it that are democratic societies, open societies with open markets and transparency. We have excellent transparency in terms of measurement and emissions monitoring. And
Terry, is that going to satisfy the idealistic undergraduate in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, who wants to see climate addressed? Is that resonating? That pure fact of trade? That
probably won't resonate with everyone. There are certain groups that just believe that hydrocarbons have to go, that they're unacceptable.
But those are the ones you need to reach and persuade,
right,
with your knowledge.
Well, I think in any extreme, there's 5 or 10% that will not be reached. The far right, the far left, the extreme of any type. And I think that's, I can't talk to those people. They believe what they believe.
Okay, so there's always an extreme at like you say at either remove, but there is that persuadable middle. It sounds like that's what you're talking about.
That's correct.
So what is the persuadable middle looking for then?
I think it comes back to their view of the world. They want a good economy. They want to be able to own a home. They want a good society. They want a lot of the things that economic development brings. And it's a good argument that we should be moving more towards manufacturing and expanding adding value to our natural resources instead of just shipping them everywhere. And I make that myself. I would love to see us have more industry developed in Canada that uses those building blocks and creates more developed products and sells higher value end products. It's not that easy. And first of all, Canada is blessed with space, relatively few people, and all sorts of resources. So we have it, and we should just use it wisely, but we should use it. But we're at a competitive disadvantage climate-wise. We're a cold country. It's far easier to set up a manufacturing facility in Texas than in northern Alberta or northern Ontario, where much of Canada is huddled along the border. That's where we live, right? Most of the population is. And there's a reason for that. The climate is better for one of them. So we have a lot of space and a lot of resources, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're the best place for manufacturing. We have high regulatory burdens. We have relatively high taxation compared to like some jurisdictions in the US. It's very unfortunate, but I hear from many people that they go to the U.S. to start or develop a business because the opportunity in Canada isn't here from the regulatory.
What's the difference between getting something permitted in the United States and other countries you're aware of versus Canada, if it's something in the oil and gas space, from your experience? Can you give us a comparator there?
The differences in actually developing a business in the United States, they've had ebbs and flows as well, where it's been challenging to build pipelines, for example. They have more of a lawsuits are a lot more common there to hinder progress on certain things, and so groups have used lawsuits a lot more in the U.S. than in Canada. But there seems to be an overarching sentiment that things need to get done more so in Canada. We're talking about it now in Canada. We need to build major infrastructure. But the impediments in Canada are everywhere, and they seem to be just a lot more severe and long-lasting than in the U.S., or longer duration in terms of the sequential permitting and then the approvals from a municipal or a provincial or a federal level, and the many branches of approval that are required, not just environmental, there's regulatory challenges that just seem to be much slower and much more pervasive here, that people, it's when there's a statistic that's never seen, which is the most vital one that I know of, but it's how much money is not invested here because of that. And I know wealthy people that would start businesses here in a heartbeat if they could in Canada, but they don't, because it's like, why would I do that? There's so much uncertainty in terms of getting something actually built. Like a basic function in Canada can take a year to just get approval for the first stage, to even like in Alberta, which is probably the most free, entrepreneurial and free-spirited of the provinces. Like, everyone wants to build a data center now, but the challenges involved in building a data center and actually getting it off the ground are formidable. The access to natural gas, the access to a good site with water and fiber optic connections. And so with all these big companies with their giant checkbooks come looking, saying, where can I build my data center? And Canada says, well, we don't really want them in this jurisdiction, but you can go over there, which happens too. And then we go to Alberta and we say, well, our grid can only handle this much, so you're going to have to bring your own power, as Premier Smith says. So companies say, okay, how do I bring my own power? And then they realize, well, that's not that easy, because this and this and this have to happen. And it can be done, but now we're talking 5, 6, 7 years, whereas they can go to the United States and find a jurisdiction and be up and running in 3 years. And they can access all of the above. Part of it is just because it's more of a developed market down there. There's a lot more options. There's a lot more power lines. There's a lot more power centers. There's a lot more pipelines. So they have more of a nexus. But Canada should be acting the other way to make it easier to develop rather than more difficult.
So energy abundance alone is no guarantee that we can turn that into prosperity for Canadians.
That's correct. The energy abundance is great because it really helps fill the national coffers and the provincial coffers. A lot of money goes to the federal government and provincial governments from resource development, not just oil and not just Alberta. Many provinces have this. In my view, I come from not inside the oil patch. I grew up in, like I said, on a farm. And so I view resources across Canada sort of more singular rather than Alberta specific. There's in some ways there's no difference between a nickel deposit in Ontario and forestry in British Columbia and oil in Alberta. We produce more than we need of all of these things, and I wish it would be more of a national discussion that because our consumption isn't that high, we should be focusing more on how do we develop all of these things collectively. Why is Alberta singled out as this renegade jurisdiction? But they have more clout because Alberta has more clout because they have more dollars and they get noticed more. But a lot of these other regions of Canada are the same. So the urge to develop, or the desire to develop new industries, as you mentioned, like to develop manufacturing and high tech and whatever else that comes along with that. We do have these resources, but we have a lot of barriers to converting those resources into something we can actually use at home here.
There's about 5 different directions I want to go in at the same time, but we have to do this one at a time. Just like to dig into this thought you have on the commonality of different resource sectors, not just mining, energy, forestry, other things, but also you have this regional divisions. Let's take down those divisions. Let's look at the country in terms of all the resources. That really strikes a note with me because of what we do at Resource Works. All the resources. We started in BC, and we really have been drawn into a more national conversation in recent years. So, absolutely 100% agreement. But I want to dig into that a little bit because I wonder what we need to do to really unlock that and make it something that people are excited about. Because I'm excited about it, and I think you are. I think a lot of our listeners are as excited as we are about it.
I think we can kind of break the logjam maybe nationally in terms of developing resources. I think we've recognized some of the problem with the interprovincial trade barriers as a prime example,
right,
where it's very difficult to do business from province to province, which makes no sense. You don't need a passport to go from one province to the other, but there can be like these invisible barriers that prevent things from happening. And so I think we recognize that there is a bigger issue here, and that's one of it, is to harmonize standards across the country. And the other one is just to have a better dialogue, which I applaud what you're working on. I think to have more of these parties in common discussions to actually understand problems. So I've been in the energy sector for a long time. What do I know about agriculture or forestry or mining? Like very little. And it's amazing to spend time with someone from those sectors. And I really enjoy talking to people from across the country that are heavily involved in some other sector and understanding what their challenges are. I went to a conference. I spoke at a conference this summer, and I happened to be on the plane with one of the attendees who I'd never met, and it was a surface land conference, surface rights negotiators. And that's part of the energy industry. We forever deal with surface rights issues in terms of how they impact the energy sector. And this gentleman explained, I learned so much on that flight about surface rights and the impediments to development that happen because of surface rights issues. And it's not energy specific, it's across everything. And he pointed to things like railway development or power infrastructure development or negotiations with farmers or whatnot. And as a result of that, I went back and did some research on there's the comical cartoon example of the California's high-speed rail network, California proposed building a high-speed rail network from Los Angeles to San Francisco at an initial cost of $23 billion. And the latest cost estimate for the whole thing is something like $130 billion. And it's 10 or 15 years behind schedule, and they've made virtually no progress on it. And they've started with a segment in the middle that they're out in the desert sort of that they're working on first, and they're still having trouble with that. And if anyone can find a litany of challenge that they've had with surface rights. There were counties that would block soil testing, for example, because for some reason that they needed to disallow it. And so a year goes by until that's allowed, till that's sorted out through the courts. And another group would challenge water usage, and local cities along the way would challenge the development of rail stations, because what did that mean for the local commuter buses gathering that would have to populate those nodes? Like, how do you get people to the train?
So this is even before you get to NIMBYism.
That's right. You're not even building anything yet. You're just arguing about, and California is kind of a good representative of Canada because they suffer the same gridlock that we do, sort of. So anytime you talk about building major infrastructure, you have all of these issues that come up, and discussions are necessary to understand. And the challenge that each of these jurisdictions faces, like a little community, the one I used in California, I wish I had a better Canadian example, but one of the cities said, like, if we're going to have a bus or a train station in our city, then we have to develop a whole ecosystem to get people to this one point, which is something I would have never thought of. But to them, that's real. Like, where does that money come from in their budget? How do they integrate that? Does somebody just write them a check? And it's the same with anything else here in Canada.
Right.
So
And we've got Mark Carney. He's made some big promises on getting the country moving back into economic development as the top or a top priority. But at the same time, I continue to hear from those who are at the pointy end of engagement in Ottawa that the thousands of hours being poured into the regulatory work that Ottawa is forcing onto the oil patch in particular, but I think mining, other sectors affected just as much, is unrelenting. It's unchanging and does not reflect in the daily lived experience this high-level political message. Right or wrong on that? What do you think? Is that the complaint at the moment?
I think that the regulatory challenges are unrelenting. I think it's frustrating to see a federal government that recognizes them, but it's been, a year now of this government and very little progress.
Is it just imprisoned in its own red tape that has been so carefully constructed that we are imprisoned now in a legislative regulatory maze?
I think it is very hard to roll back a lot of the red tape that exists, and I wouldn't say the sad part of it, but a lot of the things are there. There's a kernel of wisdom there, or there's a good reason that they're there. There's a standard that almost, as one example, that few people know about, but there's a requirement by a Canadian agency that any company above a certain size, and it's not very big, has to file a report with the federal government annually. You have to. And you have to say what you've done to eradicate child and forced labor from your supply chains. And it's, you might think from a glance, like, hey, that's a good idea that we're doing our part. But if you read into the requirements, this has been in place for about 3 years now, due at the end of May every year, and the requirements they verge on the absurd. You have to document not just the first level of supply chains, but you're supposed to comment on the second and third levels of supply chains as well. So if I buy a computer, I'm supposed to understand and report on the child labor conditions that went into those components, which is an impossibility to document for anyone, never mind the third level, which is where those materials came from. But that's an expectation, and so that's a requirement that has to be filed with the government, and there's teeth in the legislation. If they decide that you're not doing enough, they can come after you, but doing enough isn't defined. But this is just one example of red tape that companies have to deal with. And I don't think a lot of companies are even aware that they're supposed to be filing these reports, but there are many more like this that are just these requirements that it's a good idea run wild, and now there's a whole entrenched sector of the government whose job is to maintain and monitor this, and how do you get rid of that? It's like, well, you don't care about child labor anymore. It's like, well, of course we do, but is this the best way to tackle it?
Yeah, so, and if you focus in on emissions, methane, the Environment Canada regulations that are slowing down investment, that are making projects more difficult to build, what's the message that's not getting through that one would hope can make change? Is there something about what's happening in the economy, including better environmental performance, that's actually happening that maybe hasn't been grasped?
I think some of the standards that have been enforced for the right reasons, again, like such as methane emission reduction or various other emission control things, again, there's a kernel of a good idea in them, but it's just the execution of them is not realistic or not sensible. It's if we want to reduce our overall emissions, having more of a holistic view to, let's say, the 80-20 idea, maybe 80% of the emissions reduction can be achieved fairly easily, and the other 20%, we're not going to worry about that so much because it just ramps up in terms of challenge and cost. The Canadian electric vehicle mandate is an example of that. It's just like we could, if the goal is to reduce emissions from transportation, there are multiple ways you can do that. One is you could just change the standards for fuel economy for vehicles. Do we need 400 horsepower V8s in cars? Or should there be a tax on that, an emissions tax, saying if you must have a monster hyper-powered vehicle, well, maybe you should pay more for it. And from an emissions perspective, I'm not saying that's the case, but if our goal is to reduce emissions, you could do that and you could reduce emissions. But to have a blanket mandate that says everyone in the country will drive an electric vehicle, it's just a square peg in a round hole. It's someone working in industry in the far north is like not likely to ever adopt that. They will shut down their operations before they'll rely on batteries for their life up there.
Right. Now, suppose you took a call from the Prime Minister and Tim Hodgson, his energy minister, and you need to give them what they need to know in less than 2 minutes. What would you say, Terry?
If I had a call from the high up powers in Canada for my advice, I think that I would try to persuade them in 2 minutes to put ideology aside and think in terms of practicalities, that the framework of adhering to a globalized definition of what we must do in terms of emissions, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we shouldn't treat it that way. I would say talk to industry, talk to each industry and say what can be done relatively easily, and we'll worry about that first in terms of if emissions reductions are your goal. And in some ways, they have to make a decision, those politicians. Do you want to build things or do you want to focus on emissions reduction? We've seen jurisdictions that have made that decision, such as Germany. They've said, we will reduce emissions, and they've deindustrialized, and they've succeeded in reducing emissions in a suicidal sort of way. So I think that's a question of, is that what you want?
And they're now reversing course.
And now they're reversing course. They've said they're quite happy with natural gas now, and they're regretting shutting down nuclear facilities. And everyone that I would know in the energy scene that watched Germany do that just shook their heads in sadness that, why are you doing this? Especially on the nuclear front with clean energy. But it was ideologically driven energy decisions, which are no different than a lot of the other ones. That's no different than Canada's.
Let's talk about China, or the two Chinas. Let's compare the China that has decided to do away with fossil fuels. It has embraced renewables. It is racing into this clean future where everything runs on electricity. And let's also not forget the other China, the China that is, over the last 5 years, has spent $500 billion on oil and gas development within the borders of the People's Republic of China, the mainland China. I'm not talking about Taiwan here. The China that is importing all the crude oil it can from Canada and storing it and using it. The China that continues to be the factory of the world that uses all kinds of inputs, hydrocarbons, plastics, to make things. Those two Chinas seem to exist in a parallel sense. And how does one decide which is the real China?
Two Chinas of that line of thinking, that one is pursuing the clean energy, you're going to be a clean energy superpower, and which has become a poster child for the climate aware movement, that China is now the only country that really cares about emissions, it seems to be. That's a line of thought that coexists with the one you're talking about, or that you mentioned, about the development of oil and gas reserves and building new coal-fired power plants
like crazy
every week.
Yeah.
And I think it's exactly the same thing. I don't think there are two Chinas. I think there's two messages that they promote to the people that want to hear it. The people that want to hear that China is a clean energy superpower simply aren't paying attention to what they're doing everywhere. China is a textbook example of the energy pie only growing. They're adding solar and coal, and they're adding wind, and they're adding natural gas and oil refineries. They're adding everything. They're just voracious. And part of that is the West's choice to farm out our manufacturing to them. They became the world's factory, right? And there's there's probably three Chinas in addition to the two that you mentioned. There's the clean energy image, there's the relentless conventional energy development, and then there's the processing side, which is extremely harmful to the environment, which we've all happily farmed out to China. Like, there's a reason that metals aren't processed in Canada or the US or Europe. It's because it's dirty business and environmentally challenging, and China doesn't mind doing that. They've created whole sectors geographical sectors where that happens, and they're toxic wastelands, that is fine because they're producing what we need. We need these critical elements, the tungsten and the magnesium and all of these things that we require for our defense and high-tech industries. And we're reliant on China for it because they're willing to bear the burden of that environmental cost. And they don't, that's not part of their messaging. You hear them, you hear the Chinese government willing to make a big deal about how much solar they're putting up, stats that they like to publish. They don't publish how much toxic waste they generate from producing the materials that go into those things. That's hidden.
Yeah. Terry, you drove across Canada recently. Something that everyone dreams of doing. Not many people actually do from coast to coast. Why did you do that, and what did you experience?
I drove across Canada this past summer. I spend a portion of every summer in Nova Scotia. I love the Maritimes, and I love the people, and I love the different outlook on life that they have there. It's and I think the only way to really absorb that, if you can, is to spend a bit of time there. Driving across Canada didn't allow me to spend a bit of time there, but when you actually drive instead of flying over it, you get a view of why things are so important to certain parts of the country. Even driving through a portion of Quebec that just from the New Brunswick border inward, it's like cheese land. There's cheese shops everywhere and fromageries and the roads are named after them, and you can tell it's a very heavy cultural item there and very important to that part of the province and the province as a whole. And then traveling across northern Ontario, just the space and the amount of trees and mineral potential, you can just imagine going across that endless province. And then you hit the prairies and you see like a total agricultural focus and the amount of grain you can see that comes out of there. And British Columbia, the beautiful scenery in the mountains, again, the mineral development and forestry. You just get a better sense for the various aspects of the province, and you have time to think about it when you're driving as well. Like you notice that you're in something different than you were 8 hours before. And I just found it a very valuable exercise to get more of a feel for the country, that we have these regional disparities that someone that lives in downtown Toronto is probably never going to resonate with the oil patches concerns in Calgary unless they come out here and spend some time. And I'm fortunate enough in Calgary, it really is a melting pot. There's people from all over the world, but a lot of Canadians come here as well. And I meet people from Quebec that come to Alberta, and they're blown away by what they discover, that like, this is the reality. Like, I had no idea that it was like this. One gentleman that moved out here, an executive level guy that moved out with his family, he thought that it was just like a toxic wasteland where things didn't grow because there was oil spills all over the ground. And I know that's a bit silly to think that, because you can obviously see that these things aren't true by looking, but they're just a general feel that people have about other sectors that build up over time through prejudices or preconceived notions, I suppose is a better word or phrase.
And we're at a moment in time when Alberta separatism seems to be a thing. It's certainly a thing that is causing a new level of political discourse between provinces. I just want to ask you, from the energy perspective, Alberta exceptionalism, the sense that Alberta is funding so much of Canada, it creates a large amount of wealth that goes to other parts of the country, which everyone, I hope, is thankful for. But maybe Alberta doesn't feel it's appreciated. And whether that is a blip, in your opinion, do you think it's tied to energy policies? Do you think that the solution to it is not necessarily addressing separatism per se, but addressing the underlying issues? What are your thoughts from your wheelhouse?
I think the Alberta separatism issue points in a little bit of a different direction than what superficially it looks like. That there is a feeling of alienation in the province, or that we're not being heard, or that we have no clout, that people just take the proceeds of what's produced, enjoy all the benefits, and disparage the source of it and diminish it and try and starve capital from it, as our Prime Minister has done less than 5 years ago. I think it's easy to look at the surface of that and the emotion of it and react to that, but I think there's more depth to it than that. So when I grew up on the farm in Saskatchewan, the farming community is totally disrespected. We feed the world. An average farmer can feed tens of thousands of families. It's unbelievable the productivity of a single farm, where that can reach around the world. You literally could feed a farmer could feed a small city. And people don't think like that, but a farmer definitely sees that. They say, where's the respect for the farming community? And it becomes part of that challenge that people in urban centers buy things from grocery stores, and that's where food comes from, and they don't think about that. And so there's elements of that, and maybe a mining community feels the same thing, and the fisheries community might feel the same thing. It's like you all love sushi, don't you? And where do you think that comes from, or whatever? So there's these pockets of this all over the place, and I think Alberta has kind of risen to the top because Alberta actually has the clout to do something about it, to say something about it, and that's just the sheer magnitude of the value that's generated from hydrocarbons. That the country has to take it seriously just because it's such a big building block of the. I mean, in the graphic is very popular in Alberta that shows how much the equalization settlement, how much comes from Alberta and goes to other parts of the country. And it is a stark graphic that shows that there is a big amount of wealth that moves out. And so I think Alberta has become like almost a figurehead, and it's like a lightning rod for discontent because it's quantifiable and it's big.
Where do you think it's going?
The separation movement in Alberta, it's hard to say where it's going to go. I think that it's going to be a two-stage process. I think there's a lot of people that are supportive of the idea of having a referendum because they want to see change. They want to see something happen. They don't want to hear lip service anymore. They want to know that they're being heard and not disrespected as much. So I think a lot of people are supportive, saying, yeah, I will support holding a referendum because that's going to get everyone's attention.
Once unleashed, might that be something that even those folks come to regret?
That's possible that people would regret developing or encouraging a referendum. My gut feeling is that it would never cross the finish line. And the reasons that I think that are, if we look at Quebec when they were so close a long time ago, in I think 1995, when they almost voted in favor, that was the feeling out of Quebec was it was quite overwhelming that they were in favor of separatism. That's just my take on it. It was a long time ago. And it felt like they were going to go. But then when people went in the ballot box and they're like, do I really want to do this? And I suspect that Alberta would be no different. There's a very vocal chunk of the population, and they make a case that we would be better off, and then they will be persuasive to a lot of people.
Terry, what's the most controversial thing you've ever written?
I've written a few articles that have stepped on some toes probably, which I don't mind doing if I feel the cause is right. And one of the most controversial was Alberta's former premier, Rachel Notley, the leader of the NDP, the sole time that the NDP was ever elected in Alberta. I wrote an article that was somewhat in defense of her. I'm not a socialist and I never will be, but people were just, the hatred was so strong for everything. And I wrote an article saying we can't blame Rachel Notley for low oil prices, which some people were doing at the time. And I just said, there's whatever your view of her management of the economy and the oil sector, which I wasn't necessarily in favor of. It said, this is just not a good idea to be having this blanket hatred. It's just not sensible. And that got a lot of negative feedback, immediate feedback. So, which is kind of ironic because it's just a plea to be sensible and But that touches back on the point that there's a certain percentage of the population that can't be reached.
Mm-hmm. And you're taking us back almost a decade ago, and you think now it's relatively calm right now, and maybe that's just because there's no major projects that are currently focusing in public discourse. It's a kind of quieter moment, but that distance ago, it was a very hot space, and you were one of the few who was out there articulating your positions and getting some heat for it, including from those who maybe were the natural supporters for your positions.
On my side, very much so. Yeah.
Which also, you think back to the when Jason Kenney became the premier after Rachel Notley was premier. One of the things he brought in was the idea of this energy war room, which later was established and became. I think war room was a kind of a regrettable term. People instantly recognized what it meant when that term was used. I think it was really more, if you were Switzerland, say, and you wanted to defend your market share for fine watches, maybe you would have a watch war room and make sure that the world understands, one of your important exports. That would be a perfectly normal thing to do and not controversial at all, I'm sure, in Switzerland. But the energy war room in Alberta became this big controversy, and it was a period when there was a lot at stake. What is your memory of that time when we had maybe a lot more heat in these issues?
Yeah, my memories of the time of kind of the peak of what I would call the energy wars were that it was very challenging because the emotions were so high, and maybe we're getting there again, but the emotions were so high, and the energy sector in Canada, which predominantly the hydrocarbon sector, was on full defense. There was very, very visible attempts to diminish the industry and ultimately get it removed from existence. Federal leaders were saying that, right? We don't need your industry anymore, and it has to go. That was the messaging. And so people are going to put on the boxing gloves, right? That when that happens. And so it was very tense. And the example that I gave about defending against extremism, for years I wrote about in defense against extremism on the climate movement side, like saying you can't lie about things, you can't make up things, you can't ignore energy realities. You can talk about the harm of hydrocarbons, but if you're going to do that, you should talk about the benefits of hydrocarbons, which keep everyone alive. And to have only this one-sided discussions, it's just damaging to the discourse because you create hatred by doing that. And so my fight was against the extreme camps to say, like, you need to stop that, you need to stop that. This is, if we want to progress, like we have to get the emotion out of it and start thinking about what needs to happen here, and here's what one side wants to happen. Can it happen? No, in my opinion, we won't have a rapid energy transition. And if you just look at the evidence, which has been borne out these days, we can see that that's true, that it's not that easy. And if we would just looked at that and said, what are some pragmatic solutions we can put in place that say, like, okay, we address emissions reduction, but here's the reality. It's a bedrock of our economy, hydrocarbon development, and it's just utterly foolish to tell us industry that we want to decimate it. So that was very, very hard to have a voice inside that didn't immediately get dumped into one bucket or the other, which was any commentator. And yet I had to be very careful, as did everybody else that spoke in the space, that you didn't automatically just get tossed in the heap. And people would toss you in the heap. The extremists of either side were very quick to toss you in the heap, like, well, he said this, that means he believes everything over here, or vice versa. And it's just not the case. Like any rational discussion that you try and have, you have to keep emotion out of it, and then you'll see things a lot more clearly. And I think that was the challenge at the time. And I think it's, on the energy side, it has gotten better in terms of that. I think because their energy reality has kind of returned. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of global examples that have shown us what happens if you try and do this too quickly. And so I think we're healing a bit there as a country. We see support for pipeline development strong across the country, right? And it's a bit, that doesn't thrill me because it's for the wrong reasons in one sense. If it's just an anti-US reflex, that's not the right reason. So even though it's a development that I approve of, I wish it was more on logical grounds than emotional ones, but it is what it is.
Terry, I wish we had more time. Really enjoyed the conversation with you.
I did as well, Stewart. Thanks for having me on. It was a great discussion.
That was Terry Etam, Calgary-based energy writer and contributing writer for the BOE Report. I'm Stewart Muir, host of Power Struggle. If there's one takeaway from today's conversation, it's that Canada's energy future depends less on political promises and more on understanding the practical realities of engineering, economics, and global markets. And Terry's decades of hands-on experience really remind me that good policy starts with good facts. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to Power Struggle on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Sharing the show helps us bring more serious, honest conversations about energy policy and Canada's future to a wider audience. You can find more episodes and information at powerstruggle.ca. Thanks for listening and watching. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time on Power Struggle.